Oh, great. Why isn't this... Why is this suddenly not functioning correctly? This is so weird. I've never had this issue before. Why is it like... My stream is working, it's just not... like, going public. This is a little bit infuriating. Oh, no, is it working now? I would love it if it is working now. I don't know why it's not. Guess I'll just have to give it a minute. This is so weird. Hello, 2 people. It says it's obviously live streaming, but for some reason it's not like it's not uploading anywhere. Okay. So this is definitely a little bit strange. Which is gonna suck because I wanted this to be a stream that multiple people could see. No, I'm good. Sorry, I'm talking to my mom. Why isn't it? I love technology. Technology is great. Why isn't it just like... This is bothersome. This is very bothersome. Hi. Fine. I guess I'll just have to go... I don't know. Show people on Discord, I guess. I guess it's just being slow? I don't know. If you don't understand what I'm saying, it's weird because I'm monitoring to make sure my stream's going well on my iPad, but like in any kind of feed, like subscription feed, or in even on like my channel, you actually have to go to the front page of my channel to see that I'm live streaming, which is really, really weird, and I don't know why it's doing that. And I can't even go like advertise on Discord because Discord is having a moment, so... Oh god, this is great. Every time I want to sit down and actually do something productive, every single time. Oh, did it just stop? You're kidding me, right? Hello, stream. There it is. Oh, God. Sorry I'm not doing anything. I would if my stream was actually working. Can you guys even hear me, actually? I'm curious. Can you hear me? Because at this point, I'm not surprised if anything's just not working. Okay, well, that's good at least. I wanted to do a stream that was a tutorial because I felt like doing a live tutorial would actually be like a good idea, because then you could actually like give people live advice as they ask for it, rather than just have to like try to answer every question. But this isn't even like, no one's apparently, it's not in, is it? Whew, okay, you know, here's a question. Did you find this stream through your like a notification, or did you find it through like subscription feed? I'm curious, because right now YouTube's being stupid, and so is Discord. And now I'm being texted, and I'm screaming inside. I'll just doodle around, I guess, while I wait. I don't know what else to do. Because I don't really want to, I feel unfair if I actually did this and like not even like 99%. Okay, then I don't know what's going on. I don't know. Maybe it's just my iPad. Maybe it's just my connection. I don't even know, because Discord's not working either, and I'm dying inside. God. Well, I feel bad if, like, not a lot of people are here to watch it. Because, like, the whole point of this was to let people be able to see things happen live and be able to ask, like, questions and, like, more specific advice or whatever. But, ugh. I don't know what's going on. I don't know. I guess I might as well just start it and just let it happen, and hopefully people can join in as it goes and whatever. But yeah, hello, I'm Zodiac. Welcome to this already train wreck of a tutorial stream for the first one. At least I'm doing it with a topic that is not too dramatic. I don't know. Can you hear me? Can you hear me dying inside? I'm dying inside. Hello, hello, hello. Because my stream is being a bit stupid and doesn't seem to be showing up on anything, whatever, so... Yeah, it's fine. Sorry I'm being quiet, I'm texting someone, it's fine. Basically what I'm gonna do, okay, well, I'm getting more people now, so that's nice. Maybe it's just going very slowly. Sorry, I'm being quiet. I'm typing something, so. I do have an Instagram, but I don't really use it. I don't really post on there all that much, especially because when I post on there, it doesn't seem it seems like I get weird. I don't feel like I get weird comments sometimes. Not weird, but they're kind of lame. I don't know. It's just I don't know how to describe it. It's just very discouraging. Whatever. Like I'll get the spam comments, or I'll get like someone who asks something that's like totally not related to the picture I just posted, and I'm just kind of like, why do I bother here? Okay, well, you know what? We'll just make this a little bit of a mini stream, because now I'm being told that apparently this isn't just me. It's just, like, it's a lot of people on YouTube who are having the same issue with the whole notification thing for streams. So, you know what? We'll just make this a little bit of a mini baby stream. So yeah, we'll make this. Y'all get a special stream. Okay, so okay. So basically, for anybody who's just joined into this train wreck of a live stream right now, it's already been going on for like how long now, and nothing's happened. Basically, I had the idea that because I have wanted to make tutorials and things, because I feel like they'd be interesting, and I do like giving advice. But the thing is with tutorials, I never know what to say, because there is like no physical way I can like give all the advice I think that needs to be given. Um, you know, I can't think of all that, and I don't feel like I can cover all of that in one tutorial, especially when I have to, like, script it and edit it, well, not even script it, I usually just ramble, but, like, edit it together and think about what I'm going to say. So I thought, you know what might be a good strategy is, what if I just do a live stream, and that way people can ask actually, like, more specific questions, and then, like, I could also do these again, too, like a follow-up. And I could give more specific advice rather than just having to try and cover all of the bases, even if I don't know what those bases are. Drinking Coke. Not sponsored. But, so this one, I had people vote on DeviantArt, for what subject they wanted, so this one is for poses. So I can start by just giving, like, a loose idea of, like, how I usually go about poses for characters, and then I can get a little bit more specific, because I know poses can be a pretty difficult thing for people sometimes, especially just like coming up with a pose. So like some basic stuff I have. I mean, if you know me, my idol poses tend to be like, just to give a really basic idea. I'm sure, like, if you look, I make fun of this all the time, is the fact that my idol poses, like my generic character just standing still, typically is like, oh god, is it buffering? Yeah, my typical idol poses is like one arm up, one arm down, or one arm on the hip, one leg straight, and then one leggy sticking out, all like pirouetted, and I just, but yeah, obviously this is not like an accurate sketch, but that typically is how like I end up doing my idol poses. And poses actually are really good for like showing a character and stuff like that, especially even if it's just a pose that's like idle. And yeah, I know it'll always be a bit delayed, but so like poses are a fun thing, and I actually do kind of like posing and stuff like that, but I like it when I'm doing more flowy poses. I'm really bad with poses where characters are just standing there, like just someone standing idle. Like those are the most difficult for me, obviously enough, or like interestingly enough. Oh, excuse me. Just because I think there's something about a character standing still that makes it so much more obvious to tell where problems are. And also I just feel like it's almost boring. I love having some kind of flow to things or whatever, things like that. So I'm trying to think of some basic advice I could give. One tip I have, like if you're looking for like a very easy, quick tip to make idle poses a little bit more interesting, or even just poses in general, is actually there's a rule of a straight and curved, where it's like you'll have your character here, and then you can do like this. And this is a pretty boring pose. This is just someone standing there, whatever. And the quickest way you can actually make this more interesting is because you leave one arm straight and you have one arm bent. And then you leave like one leg straight and you have like one leg slightly bent. And that's like the quickest way you can make a character a little bit more like interesting in their pose. And that goes for anything. Like it goes for animals too. Because I saw someone say they don't draw humans, they draw animals. Well, that goes for animals too. An animal just standing like this isn't all that interesting. Or if I were going to get more accurate with the legs, an animal just standing like this isn't all that interesting. But if you take like their legs and you make one bent, and you take this and like you make one stretch it out, make the other one a little bit closer. This is like my default animal pose right here, honestly. But yeah, that's that's a quick way to make your poses a little bit more interesting when a character's standing there, is just having like one bend and one straight. That's really good with the arms. Yeah, those are just my stick figures. And believe it or not, stick figures are a really good way to get in the idea of a pose. If you just use like a stick figure and you can like get the gesture of things. Like stick figures are a pretty good way to get a very flowing pose. You obviously would have to fill out things like in this and like fill out where actual limbs and joints would be, but stick figures are a really good way for gesture, and gesture is very important. If if you've ever been in any kind of art class, they'll always tell you gesture is very important. Gesture being something like you have your action line and you do whatever. I'm not really a good one to talk about all the really technical terms, but you can definitely find a lot of like better fleshed out tutorials online, and even just on YouTube, that'll talk about like gesture and line of action and things like that. So please go look those up if you want a bit more of a technical, like in-depth thing. What about birds, not four-legged animals? Well, with birds, well, like, if you're just having a bird stand there, birds are really easy to get away with it comes to, like, more basic poses. I'm not very great at drawing birds. I'm decent at drawing bird wings, not so much birds. But, like, if you just have, like, kind of a bird, their wings are usually, if they're idle, their wings are usually folded up, and their legs are, like, I don't have any references on me, so forgive me for being a bit crappy with this. But even then, that rule can apply too. Like, if you just have a bird sitting there, you could even have it where, like, one wing is a little bit more like this, and one's more tight and up here. You can have one where a leg is a little bit more out, and one is a little bit more in. It does apply to just about kind of anything. The idea of just basically don't make every limb do the same thing. There's a sort of rule with like, especially in animation, about twinning. Twinning is where, like, to bring back my lovely stick figure, twinning is where like the legs and the arms are doing the exact same thing on both sides, which is usually pretty boring, And so even if you're trying to do something where like the arms are supposed to be in the same pose, you can actually fix twinning by just by offsetting one of the arms a little bit, So twinning is something that like usually a good like the good best starting strategy to getting more interesting poses is by just taking those limbs and making those limbs do different things from one another, and having them not match with one another. That's the quickest way to make something more dynamic. So that's like some really that's very bare basic stuff. But now I can get poses with different body types are hard. Oh, well, here we go. How would I talk to you about this? Because here's the thing. When it comes to poses with different body types, you can, I mean, different body types are hard. That is truth. It is always true. But honestly, if you can figure out how, like, once you really, this is why I say you have to learn, like, the basics of art before you can really start breaking any rules, because, once you know how things like fat and muscle and things like that work on a human being, you can turn any pose into whatever body type you want. To actually use something, let's see, I'll come up with a really basic scratchy pose here. And this is actually a good strategy. If you want to get like a more interesting pose, but you don't know what to go for, be really loose and be really like, be really loose with it, be really scratchy, and don't worry so much about getting what your character looks like. Just get a figure into there, and then you can refine it later. You do not have to make your art look pretty on the first rendition. And I'm not going to go too much into how different body types work. That would be like a tutorial for its own thing. But like if you were just to get like a really basic pose right here, I'm not filling in those hands, like a really basic pose right here for something. You can technically turn this into any body type. Now, obviously, it would require an understanding of how, like, body fat and things work. But, like, for example, if you wanted to make this character, like, here's some tips right here. If you wanted to make this character, like, a woman, for example, you just make sure that, like, there's a little bit more, like, on the top, you make her just things a little bit more feminist, you make, you just add you make things a little bit more feminine, whatever. But if you wanted to make this, I should probably do this on a separate layer, actually. That would make things a lot quicker. Hang on. If you want to make this a man, though, you just kind of make it, like, you make the hips just a little bit slimmer. You make the legs a little bit more muscly rather than whatever. And so you can you can easily turn a pose into either a man or a woman, just depending on what you're going for. And again, I'm not going to get super into how you draw the differences between drawing like masculine and feminine like figures and stuff like that, because again, that's a tutorial for another day. But like, for example, to go back to the body types thing, all you would have to do is just take this pose and make some adjustments. Like if we wanted to make this character a lot more buff, we just define the neck, we just kind of make things a little bit wider and more broad, and you can even take this pose and you can like adjust things to fit what you need, but you just need to make things like a little bit more broad. And obviously this is like going for like super like buff whatever. It depends. I don't know what character you're trying to draw, obviously. But like you can have, if you just come up with a really basic pose, even if that basic pose is skinny, you can turn it into something that better fits a different body type. And these tips all work on feral animals / non-human bodies as well, I believe. They do, and I can give an example of that in a second. And then, so for stuff like that, and even then, if you just want to draw a basic body type, but you want to change it, you can actually just take some of this and, like, adjust it. Like, if you want to make them shorter, you just kind of start making some of those proportions a little bit shorter. And these are good tips for, like, if you're good at drawing a pose for a specific body type, then draw that specific body type and make adjustments accordingly. Sometimes working from what you know is easier than just trying to do something new. And references always help. And this does work with animals. I'm a little less experienced with animals in some cases, but like, for example, if I was just making a really basic, and if I'm using my basic bitch animal pose right here, you have and animal anatomy is a bit different than human anatomy, obviously, but there are things that you can look at that are similar. This is a very long-legged animal, but that's fine. Works for my point. Okay, so like if you had a really basic animal pose, this is a very shoddy animal pose right here. Hang on. So if you worked with this and you wanted to, for example, make this, you know, or if you wanted to make this animal, for example, like, let me think, like, if you want to make this animal, we'll just go with the whole, like, make it more muscular, more, like, bigger, you just would have to work with the pose, and now that you have an idea of what you're going for, you can, like, make things larger, you can make things more rounded, you can work, like, you can make these limbs thicker, you can make them more stout even, you know, and obviously this would take some knowledge of how, like, certain limbs work and, like, bone structures especially. Honestly, posing, a lot of it, like, with gesture is just understanding poses and things. Like, now it kind of looks like a bear. Looks like this is my bear friend. But yeah, so if you kind of have a basic understanding of how, like, bones work for certain things, that can be, like, half the battle right there, and then there you go, you got a bear. You got a very long-legged bear. Okay, hang on, I saw a really good question. For posing, how would you go about posing something that lacks certain appendages but is still keeping it realistic? Or fluid. I know I have a character, hang on, I can't get a reference because every time I try to leave, like, it doesn't work out too well when I try to leave, like, Procreate or something like that. I have this character named Sage, and she's a perfect example because she has no arms, and she's very proud of the fact that she has no arm, and she's totally okay with the fact that she has no arms. So I don't have a reference very close, but she's probably a good example for this. A good strategy for some reason, it does depend on what kind of appendages, like, they're missing, but, like, to use Sage as my little example here, for one thing, is just for, like, working with what's already there, for example, that's a good starting point. Like, for Sage, what I would do, especially because there is a lot of focus on her legs, so what you would do is, depending, of course, I don't know what they're missing, but, like, for example, since Sage is missing her arms, I worry first on how, like, her torso and her legs work, because your arms do work independently of you. So while she still has, like, her shoulders, you know, she still has her torso and her legs and her shoulders. So you work on, as you focus on, like, you know, you have her legs doing her thing, and she doesn't necessarily have any arms or legs, but she still does have, or she does have her leg. I'm sorry. When I talk too long, I start to lose track of what I'm even saying. Okay, so she doesn't have her arms, but she does have her shoulders. So her shoulders can still move, and I'll focus on her torso right now for posing purposes. So for one thing, you do have to consider is the fact of balance, because when you do not have your arms do help you a lot with your balance. So it would be really, I mean, something like her, she's cartoony enough to where, like, she probably has pretty good balance without her arms. But, you know, so, like, even though she doesn't have it, she doesn't really need it. But if you're, for example, since she does have her shoulders, and she can still move her shoulders, a strategy, if you want to figure out where her shoulders would be, would actually to be drawing where the arm would, you feel like the arm would be moving, and then actually kind of drawing and cutting off the shoulder where it's supposed to end. And that's a really good strategy for figuring out how the rest of a limb would be positioned if some of the limb is missing, because they can still technically move as if the limb was already there. To give another example, if a character was missing part of their leg, for example. So, I mean, obviously I can't do anything fully rendered because this is just really quick ideas of of how to think when you're drawing this kind of stuff. You know, if a character, for example, was missing part of their leg, so, like, they have one good leg, that leg should probably be positioned. Obviously, they won't have any weight to put down. They have no weight to put on there. So since they are missing part of their leg, all of their weight would be on this foot, or if they had like a cane or a crutch or whatever, would be over there. So that's something to think about at first too, is that all of their weight is being put down on this side, in this picture's case. And if you needed to figure out where to position the leg, just think about like the whole leg as a flow, and then just only draw what is supposed to be there. You know, and then there you go. You can technically, now obviously this character is off balance because I didn't plan this. I'm doing this pretty quickly. Realistically, if they were bouncing on one foot, that foot would be a little bit more centered to their gravity. But like a good strategy for limbs is if that limb is still technically there, or part of it is, just think about the whole thing together and then only include what is actually there on the character. And that goes again for animals and things too. You would have to do a little bit of research, especially if it was an animal or a human that lost a leg, for example, because that would actually take some consideration of center of gravity and weight and things like that. So that would be a little bit, like, you would have to really sit down and think about that, you know, because obviously a character with no leg can't put their weight on their imaginary leg unless they had a prosthetic. So, you know, that would be what I would do for those, is just kind of think about where they would be, and then you can include them in there. You do have to make sure to do your research and make sure you look at references if possible, because those are always important, and that's always very, very helpful. I'm always trying and failing to draw that. I'm just fixing up the anatomy on the thing I like to draw. How would you do poses with a style that has less joints? Like not having prominent elbows, I guess. Well, I can try. I'm probably not the best to ask for advice for this, because obviously my style normally obviously does include joints usually, but I would say there probably would be best to think about it with some kind of vague. It really does still apply in some ways. Like, I guess if I was going to just kind of make a style for that on its own, you would still need to think about weight, and in a way, you'd still need to think about how joints work. So even if they don't have elbows, you'd need to figure out where that arm would naturally bend, because, for example, to show what maybe you shouldn't do with a style like this, I'll make this a little bit bigger. If you were just drawing, like, for example, if you had, like, the Adventure Time noodle arms, if you were drawing these noodle arms doing this doesn't really look right. Could it look appealing? Yes, but obviously this doesn't look proportionate. So even if you don't actually draw in the elbows, it would not hurt you to still think about where the arm would naturally bend if they did have an elbow, and then fill in the kind of noodle fire hose arm from there, because that way you can actually understand. Same thing goes with legs. If you were to draw a leg, like, I mean, obviously these are a little bit easier, but for example, if this character was going to have, like, we'll just make them do a crab position. If they were going to have their legs bent, this doesn't look proportionate. And I'm exaggerating, obviously. That's a very big exaggeration. Doing something like this, it makes it look like their knees are down here, which doesn't really look all that right. So even with legs, it would probably help you out if you actually still thought of it having some kind of form, and then added the curviness in, because now something like this makes it look like they still have joints. It just looks more stylized, you know? So that would be my tips. Obviously, I'm not the best to ask for that, because I don't use that whole rubber hose style with limbs. I usually have some kind of joints, because personally, I like having the ability to have, like, really sharp edges when it comes to arms and legs. So, so, you know, that would be what I could think of off the top of my head. There's probably other places that could help you better with that, if you look around online. But I guess that would be the advice I would give to that. Oh my god, Zodiac crab pose. Yeah. You gotta scuttle. Ask Lavender Town. Yeah, Lavender Town's probably a good one to ask that. She might have actually talked about that before. I don't know. I don't really watch her videos all that much. I've watched a few of them. There might be one where she actually talked about like posing or proportions or something like that. So I look around there. She's definitely a good one to look to. I personally, I don't love her art style. It's just not really my thing. It's not my cup of tea. I could see exactly why people would like it, and it's definitely not bad. It's just it's not to my personal taste. But yeah, I think she's probably a good one to look for with stuff like that, because she seems to make it work pretty okay. You know, so yeah, I'm definitely not the most expert when it comes to like rubber hose and whatever. So yeah, any more burning pose questions and stuff? Everyone's talking about the W pose. I guess I'll answer a different question while I'm sitting here. Do you still like Steven Universe? Yes, but no, I'm not going back to doing fusions, and I'm not. Might do the occasional fan art, and I do have a few gem OCs I might draw again someday, but overall, I'm not really like. I still like the show, I'm just not really active in the fandom anymore. Anyway. Okay. All right. How do you do a pose like really energetically? Well, honestly, gesture's your best bet when it comes to energetic poses. It's really about like it's all about exaggeration. Even if you have something realistic, if you really want to emphasize that somebody is energetic, you want to really exaggerate things. Jackson might be a good example for this. Like this is obviously going to be very, very exaggerated, and you'd have to do it like if you were to do a gesture for something energetic, you really need to like exaggerate what you're doing, because with that exaggeration, it comes off more energetic, it comes off more expressive, and that's how you're going to get energetic things. Like if, for example, if I was going to show this more filled out, even if you have a bit more, again, even if your style is a bit more realistic, or if you like drawing things with a bit more realistic, exaggeration is still very useful when actually getting an expression or a pose across. At least exaggerate more than like you would normally, because that is going to get a better idea of like, you look at this and you can tell this character is excited, even without an expression, you can tell that this character, they got some energy going on. I would probably fix an arm a little bit. This arm's a little bit funky, but definitely do exaggeration and things like that. And like even just standing like an idle pose that's not like actually moving, just having like things like, and sometimes it can just be little things like having just a little bit more confidence, whatever, like even just doing something like this. Like even just doing something like that, that's something that looks a lot more energetic than just standing still. If you want to make something look energetic, try to include a lot of movement, try to include a lot of a lot of energy, a lot of exaggeration, whatever. Like for example, if you wanted to do something energetic as opposed to casual, somebody who's just kind of standing there like casually, if they were waving to you, they might just kind of do this, like it would be more relaxed, a little bit more whatever. But if someone's like energetic, they're probably waving to you like this, you know? So exaggeration really is a key to getting like personality and things like that across. Okay, hang on. And if I miss your question, you are free to ask it again. Please do. I obviously I'm trying to get everything I can. Any tips on making poses where characters look like they are interacting, even with a reference? I'm struggling with it. That is hard, and that is something that will definitely need, that is something that will get better with practice. References, of course, are key, but because you said you do look at references, part of, like, my strategy when it comes to having characters interacting, sometimes the best way is to be as loose as possible. For example, if you were having characters hugging, don't even think about, like, what the characters look like. Don't think about what body types they have. Just think of, like, their rough height and, like, a rough idea of their size to each other. Like, for example, if you were to have two characters hugging, just be as loose as possible and draw these kinds of forms. And, like, just be really loose about who. It would probably be helpful so you don't get confused as to use, like, two different colors. I'm not right now, but just because for that. But if you draw, like, something kind of loose, just getting the idea of where they are together, it can really help figure out where it is, and where everything is supposed to be. Even just doing, like, for example, like, with even just kissing or whatever, like, just doing a very loose idea of, like, where the two heads are, and then, like, the idea of where the bodies are. You know, like, having, like, hands right here. So references are going to be key, and, like, having characters interact is going to be something that'll have to happen more with time, and practice. But usually a good strategy for coming up with, like, for doing those poses is not focusing on finishing the characters as you draw them, and instead just roughing in the idea of how they're going to be posed and positioned before you ever start going and refining. Because, I mean, once you get an idea, you can go back and, like, refine it and detail it and put in all the little character quirks and things like that. How do you figure out how to draw specific characters or body types from different angles? I did kind of say this before. I feel like body types would deserve its own kind of tutorial because body types are a very challenging thing. For one thing, I would suggest learn how different body types work, especially when it comes to, like, things like body fat and muscle. When you learn how that sits on, like, a skeleton or a body, that'll help you a lot. There's also just the fact of, like, again, sometimes what you just need to do is just come up with a really loose idea of, like, what your pose is going to be, and if you know how, like, body types work, you can really get in there and you can go back and refine it to match what you're going for, you know. Like, if this character, for example, had, like, big mazongas, you know, like, so sometimes you just have to get, like, a rough idea of what pose you're going for, and then go back and refine it to make it match the body type. Again, like, work with what you're good at and with what you know, and turn it into something different to start with is usually a good idea. Tips on fighting poses or aggressive poses in general. Can you draw some quick examples too? Fighting poses are definitely a reference thing. I still, like, with poses, honestly, guys, I still use references all the time with poses. It is always a good idea to use references and things like that. So for fighting poses, let's see. If you're only doing one character, for one thing, it depends on, like, obviously if they're just fighting with their hands. I would do research on, like, actual fighting techniques. I mean, it would depend on what character you're drawing. If the character, for example, like, they're self-taught in fighting, they don't learn anything, they're going to be a little bit more unprofessional. But if, like, they are a trained fighter, look up certain things because, like, there's certain form and whatever, and, like, just going off of, like, a fighting thing, for one thing, you might, like, if somebody's, like, ready to fight and they're, like, in a ready-to-fight pose, they might have their hands up, they might be more guarded. This kind of stuff is going to be a little bit more, like, you know, this person's very, very short, but, you know, like, that's a ready-to-fight kind of pose. For something in action, it would depend on what you're doing, and that goes back to the sort of gesture thing. Gesture is really, really, really good for, like, very action-y poses. Hang on, I'm trying to come up with a pose in my head because I can't go get a reference right now. So, like, if we were gonna do like a foot, you'd have to, hang on, I'm figuring out, guys. I'm sorry. Like, if you're gonna do, like, a foot flying at you, you would want to, like, just kind of roughen the idea of, like, what you're going for, look at some references, like, people doing it from, like, action movies, whatever. Maybe they have, like, their arm, like, if you want to be super dramatic, they have their arm punching, they have one arm back here, whatever, you know, things like that. I'm not great with fighting poses. Again, that's one of the things I use a lot of references for. So, you know, it would depend on what you're going for. For weapons, I would actually suggest, like, for example, if someone's, like, throwing a staff at someone, draw the staff first, and then you can actually draw the character attached to the staff, because the staff is the leading force here. If they're putting all of their force into something they're throwing down, draw the staff first, and then you can draw the character swinging it. Since they are the leading force, their body is going to shift, going after, you know, like, the staff. And these are very shoddy poses. These are definitely not, like, my best poses, but these are just kind of this is how to think, you know? If they are swinging a weapon, probably draw the weapon first and have the body be following the flow of the weapon. Because, like, obviously, though, if they're just holding the weapon back, you'd actually more draw it, like, you know, poised, ready to strike kind of thing. If they're not already, like, if they haven't actually done anything yet, because you just got to figure out who is actually, like, what is actually moving. That's actually a really good thing to think about whenever you're doing an action pose. What is the force leading the person? Like, you know, if it's their fist, probably draw, like, think about their fist first and have their body be following afterwards. Because if you're actually fighting, putting all of your force into a hit, your whole body is going to follow that first. If you're coming at someone with your fist, your whole body is going to follow that. Your legs are going to follow everything else. If you're swinging a weapon, your body's going to follow that weapon. So if you're actually in the middle of hitting something, try and focus, like, get an idea of where the object is or what your force is, and then help the rest of the pose follow that and flow into that. Okay. And then also, if someone's getting hit by something, that's a little bit different. You just got to figure out, like, where they're getting hit. You know, like, if someone, like, got punched or hit in the stomach, they're probably, like, you know, flying back like this. They might have, like, arms out in shock, you know. It's really just figuring out, like, where the impact is or where the force is when it comes to, like, in the moment fighting poses. And again, like, action movies, action games, whatever, stuff like that, those are really good references for figuring out how, like, the sort of anatomy of fighting is, I guess, to say. Oh, goodness, sorry. Excuse me. How do you draw sweaters on characters in a more dynamic poses? Like, 15 of my characters have sweaters on one of their outfits, teach how. I won't go super delving into how, like, clothes work on a character, because, again, that could be its own stream. But for example, now I will say this, if we're talking realistically, if somebody is fighting in a sweater, that's going to be a little hard, because it's so bulky. But, like, for example, if we had this character, and this character, was, like, I don't know, like, running or something, whatever. Clothing, especially when it comes to baggy clothing, you have to think about weight and force. Like, so for example, this character is running in this direction. So with a sweater, for one thing, the front of the sweater is probably going to be a bit more pushed here, and it's actually going to kind of, like, flow out a little bit here, like it's been caught by air. So that's a good way to actually show motion and stuff like that. If the arm is stretched out here, it's going to be kind of pushing back here. If it's all scrunched up right here, it's going to be pushing in the direction of the wind, and it's going to be falling down with the gravity, but it's going to be definitely very bunched up, like, in an area right here, because that's where the joints are. It's really, like, you'd think about it the same way you just think about them standing idly. It's about gravity and motion, and obviously, depending on the weight of the clothes, if the clothes is really heavy, it's probably not going to flow very fast. as opposed to if the clothes were very loose, very light. Like if this character was like, for example, wearing a cape, if that cape was really light, it would be flowing like, it'd be flowing out there, you know, depending on how fast the character is running. If that character was super weighted, though, the cape might actually just be right here, and just flowing out right that. So it just depends on like how heavy the clothes are, how loose the clothes are, gravity, and then how fast a character is moving. How do I do perspective in my art? The proportions always end up looking weird. Well, I'm not the best at perspective either, honestly. Let me think. When it comes to things like, I'll give some tips. I'm not going to be able to do a full out thing about like perspective because I'm not the best at perspective, but there are tons of tutorials online. Trust me. Like just look up like how to do perspective in art. Trust me, it'll help a lot. But like with poses, for one thing, there is like, I won't go too all into like how like horizon lines and things like that. But like for example, like if you're just doing something where I don't know where I was going with that. But anyway, like for example, if a character was going in this direction, for one thing you got to figure out like where they're going, you know? Like almost in a example actually here. This is actually, Procreate has a good little tool to help me explain this. For one thing, you have to figure out, like, which direction the character is technically going in. So, like, if they are flying... Hang on, let me... if they're going, like, in this direction, and they're actually going, like, backwards into the distance, into the sky, then their body would be flowing kind of like this, you know, if you were to take a square. And obviously you'd have to... please look up like the rules of perspective because I'm terrible at talking about perspective. But you know, like they'd be going like this, and you can make it more dramatic or whatever depending on what you're going for. I would definitely start small before you try to do anything like super crazy and super forced perspective. Another strategy was like, if you were to draw an arm, for example, like an arm coming towards you, you know, for one thing, the hand's going to be super big, depending on what you're doing. But, like, if you were trying to figure out where the elbow joint was, and you have your two starting points, think about it like this. Like, this is your cylinder, and you're trying to figure out where the starting point be. Figure out where your midpoint is with this, which would be, like, about right here. And then you can kind of fill it in. And you just got to remember that, like, the further back it goes, the smaller it's going to look. The more forefront it comes, the larger it's going to look. And obviously it's different with bodies because bodies are shaped. This is very forced perspective right here. But because bodies are shaped, like, not uniformly, so it's a bit different than, like, dealing with a square. And you can actually get away with a little bit more whenever you're not dealing with that. But sometimes a good way, like when you're dealing with joints, like for example, if you had like a leg going in the distance or whatever, and you needed to figure out where the knee was going to be, figure out where your midpoint is. If your midpoint's right here, then your knee's probably going to be about like right here, you know? And then you can draw it in accordingly. Again, I'm not good at this, but there are tons of tutorials online for perspective drawing, so please go look at those because those people are a lot better. Oh, goodness. Zodiac, my dude, just make a Skillshare course already. See, well, that's the thing I'm doing this. It's because this is a live tutorial, so you guys can ask me more specific questions about things. What if you're having trouble making their face a different way? Well, that, again, there's a lot of tutorials, and there's actually a lot of references for drawing faces in different directions. It's just a matter of, like, you know, learning the anatomy of a face and figuring out how those planes work and stuff like that. So I would personally, just because I'm not the best at explaining it, and I want to try and get to more specific things about posing specifically, I would look up some references for that. There's tons out there, and I would also look up some tutorials because there's a lot of really, really good ones out there that are also written and like drawn out with examples. This sounds random, but can you draw a cat with its head tilted up and its mouth open? Well, I'm not very great at cats, but, like, just doing this off the top of my head. This is really, really rough, but, you know, like... There, that's the best I got. I usually don't draw animals unless I have references, so... Or I usually have references when I draw animals, so... And oddly enough, I discovered recently I'm significantly better at drawing rabbits than I'm drawing at cats for some reason. Okay. Super weird question, but how do you make a character look more rigid, like if they were a wooden puppet? Well, that would also be a reference thing, and that would really just be figuring out your pose and making them look rigid. In fact, honestly, the best way to make something look rigid without having the pose feel too stiff is to still figure out, like, a gesture for it. Like, you know, like, still figure out your gesture, still figure out, like, where the curves and things like that would be, but then just make sure you fill out joint. I know, because I have to think about this when I do robots. Figure out where your curves would be, but then fill in joints to be stiff and uniform, you know? This way, you're not having a stiff pose, but things are still, like, moving around it with some kind of flow and some kind of energy, as opposed to, like, you know, just being, like, really stiff and whatever. So you still want to think about, like, the whole body working together, but just you can think of the parts. Once you have an idea of what position they're going to be in, you can start thinking about the joints and the limbs in a more uniform way. And I know this because this is what I have to, this is how I think whenever I'm doing, like, robots or dolls or things that have a stiffed position, or, like, uniformed joints, you know? And again, I'm just looking at the first questions I see, and this is a tutorial stream, so I'm trying to focus on questions specifically about posing. So... how does one draw the lower part of the legs? Well, that's more of an anatomy thing than a pose thing. I can do a whole tutorial on, like, what I know about anatomy and proportions and things like that. But for poses, it's, like, really the best way to think about it when it comes to poses is just, like, it being like kind of like this. That's the simplest way you can think about it in a more, like, it's obviously not super realistic, but that's, like, the easiest way you can think about it. Yeah, that's a little bit more of an anatomy thing, and you can look up stuff like that, and there's tutorials about how to draw legs. If we're going with the whole, like, stick figure idea, you'd just be, like, drawing this, you got to figure out where, like, the shoulders, like, you know, a person has shoulders, person has, like, legs with the joints. If you wanted this character to have 4 arms, though, for example, you just have arms accordingly. Just like you would the top pair of bars, just figuring out where that would be. Oh no, did it cut out? Oh no, no, no. Oh, did it not? Okay. I panicked for a second. I've had streams that have, like, totally crashed on me before, and I'm like, oh god. Okay. All right, good. All right. So, yeah, when it comes to extra limbs, you really just have to figure out A, what kind of limb it is, whether it's a leg or or wings or arms, whatever. And then you just have to figure out where they would be. Like, for example, if you didn't want your arms to be, like, your second pair of arms to be in the other pair, here's the shoulders and, whatever, doing that. Now, obviously, there is differences when it comes to, like, how you would render that, like how that would look on a human form, but just for posing, like posing for posing's sake, that's how you'd think about it. For animals, like, for example, if you were doing I meant to make that a dog, not a rabbit, but if you're just doing a dog and you wanted this dog to have like more than 4 legs, you would simply have to figure out what legs you wanted and figure out where those legs would be on your dog, and then there you go, you got a dog with 6 legs. And again, how you render that and how that would look like naturally attached to something, that's more of an anatomy proportions thing, and stuff like that, which again, I could talk about, but like, just because this is about posing, that's just how you think about it for posing. And wings are kind of similar in the sense where you just need to figure out, like, how wings technically work. Why am I drawing those wings incorrectly? You just have to figure out how wings would work, and then you can, like, figure out how to attach them to a person. Like, if you're going with the typical wings attached to the shoulder blades kind of thing, you just bloop. You go bloop, bloop, bloop. And now you have posed your wings, and you can render them out, and then whatever, depending on what wings you have. Anyway, okay. Sitting down / leaning on something poses. For leaning on something, because I think that'll be faster. For leaning on something, it depends how much weight you're going on. Like, if they're leaning on, like, a box, for example, and they are putting all of their weight on that box, it would be a matter of, like, figuring out where they are, and it would be a matter of putting weight on it. Like, for example, if it was an arm, their shoulder would go up. If they're putting all of their weight on this one shoulder, their shoulder would go up. This side would probably go down to counter that. Just make them all chill with their thing on their waist. Their leg might be out here, the other one might be here. So it would just be a matter of, like, if they're putting all of their weight on something, try and figure out where their source is, and then you can refine it accordingly. And then you can usually build your pose on top of that, after figuring out where the weight happens. Don't worry, Pyth, it's not notifying a lot of people, so it's fine. As for sitting, I would always figure out what object they're sitting on first. Like, I guess they're just sitting on a cinnamon roll, I guess. I don't know. So if, like, someone was sitting on something, you want to figure out where they're sitting first, and then, like, kind of figure out where they're going to be, because obviously different heights is going to change that, but you want to just figure out where they're sitting, and then just remember that their weight is right on their ass. It's on their ass. So you just want to make sure you build your pose with it being like that, and make sure their legs are positioned in a way to where it makes sense with the object they're sitting on, stuff like that. So that's how you do that. And then leaning on the wall is similar. If they were leaning on a imaginary brick wall, it would just be a focus of, like, where is their weight going. So if, like, they were being cool and they were sitting leaning on, why they have, this one has no neck, but it's fine. If they had that, then they'd be leaning on their shoulder, and their weight would be going this way. There would still have to be a little bit of, like, weight on their feet, because obviously otherwise they'd fall. But, so that would be my tips for that. It's just figuring out where the weight is and where the center of gravity is and stuff like that. Whew. What about lying down poses? Well, it depends on what angle. If we're talking about an angle from, like, the side, laying down would be a little bit more of a matter of figuring out where anatomy is, and this would be something you'd really need to look for references for, because if, like, you are totally relaxed and you're, like, laying flat on the ground, it's gonna look really uncomfortable if you're, like, laying on a flat surface, that's a little bit more figuring out how it goes. If you're doing somebody laying on the ground, however, from the top, that's a little bit more different, because that would actually more depend. That's something that you'd have to do a little bit more with like hair or clothing. But usually with that kind of thing, it becomes a little bit more carefree. It's kind of as if like they're underwater. You still have to think about where they would be, because obviously you couldn't do their arm back in nothing. But you know, you get a little bit more freedom about how you pose them, because you are no longer thinking about weight, because all of their weight is down on the ground that they are laying on. So you can just really have them, you can have a little bit more freedom about how they're posed, just having them look relaxed and whatever. Hang on, there was a question back here that I feel bad because I saw it, but I didn't answer it. Tips for drawing someone IRL before, any tips for drawing someone in real life before they move, like capturing their pose enough to fill in more later. Well, that's actually just a tip with gesture. I mean, that would be something, because I don't really do a lot of life drawing. You know, like, but if you want to just get like the rough idea of how someone is positioned before you fill in all the details, that would have to be, you'd have to just learn to get gesture, like draw in 30 seconds. There's tutorials about this, but like drawing something, a good practice would actually be look at a photo and draw it, like get the gesture in there as fast as you can. And then you can fill in all the details later. That would literally just be a matter of like, you know, just looking at it, and just don't worry about any of the details. Don't worry about like how big anything is. Don't worry about what they're wearing. Just draw in the basic gesture of how they are positioned, and then you can fill in all the details after the fact. Tips on posing characters with more limbs than normal, say 8, but not making it look cluttered. I have a character with a lot of limbs, and normally we're fine, but with fun poses it looks cluttered. Well, it's hard for me to say that from a posing thing. From a proportion standpoint, it would just depend on what like kind of body your character has and where you've put the hands and the arms or whatever. Like if you had a person, for example, with say 8 arms, for one thing, you can, if you want to just make it look generally more, you might have to give them a bit longer of a torso, which will look weird by itself. Like, this looks a little bit strange, but when you actually start adding in, like, 8 arms, like, for example, if they were going down the side of the body, having a longer torso will give you more space to work with. You know, whatever. Another one would just be having to, like, work with, like, where they are specifically, because, like, obviously here, let me think, like, if you had a character that had 8 arms, first of all, figure out, like, where they're all supposed to be, like, whether it's, if we're going with the whole thing that they're all the way down the side, for example, and then just figure out, like, where they are supposed to be, like, where their arms are, and just plan it out a little bit, you know, if you plan it out, you can actually use these, like, arms and stuff to fill blank spaces, you know? Like, for example, if you had a blank space there, you can use it to just, like, you can use these limbs to fill in that blank space. That would probably be something that relies a little bit more on planning rather than just posing in general. Or just having to tweak the character's, like, proportions so that the arms, like, fit a little bit better into with the body and things like that. But I would just say plan it, and if you feel like something's cluttered, then just move them around, you know? So that would be the advice I guess I could give with that. I don't know exactly how to say, because, again, I don't know exactly where the character's arms are and things like that. But, you know, yeah. How do you draw characters in relaxed/neutral positions? Well, neutral positions, you don't always have to, like, honestly, with neutral positions, I do a lot of neutral positions because I'm always drawing, like, new random character references, but sometimes it's just a matter of, like, for one thing, it's just drawing, like, having the limbs in a place where it's idle, but it's not entirely closed off from everything, you know, where it looks idle and relaxed, but it's not uninteresting, you know, like something like this. That's a pretty relaxed pose and things like that. If you were doing a character that was like lounging around, for example, you might sometimes with a relaxed sometimes in fact, you know what, I think a good tip I could give with relax is use a lot of curves. When you use a lot of really, like when you're doing a gesture, use a lot of flow and a lot of curves, because that comes off more relaxed than having like a leg straight out or an arm sharply bent, you know. What about a character with two or more heads? How do you go about posing them? I would say it's similar with the whole idea with limbs. It would have to matter, like, again, like, what kind of character you're doing. Like, so if you just had a character, like, starting with the torso, this one would be interesting, because I do usually start with heads. But, like, for something like that, I would actually start with the torso, since that would become the more unified thing. And just make sure, for one thing, make sure they fit in, and also figure out where they do attach to the body. So if they attach here, and again, like, thinking about that from, like, a sciencey standpoint, that would mean their spines would have to either fuse together or would have to have two spines, which would also mean like a fused pelvis or something like that. But like figure out where the necks do attach to the body, or if their heads are attached together too. So I would start with the torso and then fit the heads in, and make sure you just know where the heads are attached. Obviously, you will have some limitations, because if we're talking about like a normal, like a mostly normal human torso with two heads attached, they won't have the ability to move their heads as much. And honestly, if you need an idea of anatomy, look at conjoined twins. Conjoined twins will give you a good idea of like actual like anatomy with someone with two heads. And then you'll have to fill in a pose based on that bone structure, kind of. Sorry, I need to adjust myself a little bit. But, you know, so I'd sit there and I'd think about it kind of like that. Just sometimes, again, sometimes with posing, a lot of what you need to think about is just bone structure and how bones work and things like that, especially when you're drawing, especially when you're posing anything that isn't a normal human or a normal animal. Because like when you start adding in extra limbs, thinking about how those bones would connect and how those bones would move, that can help you a lot when doing anything that's not a normal human. Posing characters who can't use one of their limbs. Oh, if you're asking about like if they still have their limb and their I talked about like missing limbs earlier on, but if we're talking about like can't actually use it, a way to consider it would be, oh, I hate this. I know exactly what character I'm going to use here. I have a character who's actually paralyzed. Her name is Stephanie. She's my beautiful girl. So yeah, I actually do have a character that's paralyzed, so I can kind of talk about this. If we're talking about like paralyzed limbs and limbs that don't function anymore, but they still have them, it's still on their body, that would actually be, you have to kind of think of those almost like something that it can't move on its own. So as terrible as it sounds, you kind of have to think about it almost like clothes or like a different kind of accessory, and one that is usually pretty heavy. For example, Stephanie here, my character, she is an air mage, so technically she could make herself fly. So if she were to do that, she could move like all of her torso, you know, but like below her hips, she couldn't really do anything else. So like while her arms can do whatever, but her legs in a lot of sense would be kind of like dead weight in a sense. So if she was flying, for example, her legs would just be here. They would be limp, they would be unposed, and they wouldn't be able to move. They would be at a neutral position that is just weight, that is entirely only moving because of weight. So like if, for example, I was to actually turn this like this way, her legs would end up being, obviously if this was her pelvis, her legs would end up being like this. And it's a little bit awkward because I'm trying not to spend too much time with these. But so when it comes to limbs that don't work anymore, even when it comes to like things like an arm, or even just something that's like injured and like can't be moved and is kind of dead weight, you just have to think with those, gravity and movement. Obviously, if the character is moving, if it's enough movement, that arm will move back a little bit. But if it's just sitting here, it'll just be going straight down, following gravity, because it can't move anywhere else. If the character was like running and they had one arm that wasn't like, that couldn't function and couldn't move on its own, obviously if they're running super fast, like 100 miles per hour, their arm might be flying back here, straight back. But if they're just like kind of running a little bit, their arm might be just sort of like sticking out, kind of like, as weird as it sounds, like just kind of like this, You just kind of have to think about it almost like a piece, like an extension of clothing, or like, I'm trying to think of an accessory that would count, or something like almost like heavy jewelry in a sense. It's because it's something that's really heavy, so it's not going to flow, but it's going to be weighed down and it's going to move as if it's not a living thing, because it doesn't, it's dead weight in a sense. Whew. Poses with a character in a cast. I mean, I've never drawn a character in a cast. That would just have to be, it would depend what kind of cast it is, but really it's like, if the character is like, has a leg cast and their entire leg is in a cast, it would just have to be stiff, and it would just have to, whatever position it's in, that would be its position, and it would probably have to only be moved by force. So that would depend on what kind of cast you're doing. And for those things, those are a little bit more stiff and they're a little bit easier to work with. You just can't move them and you can't make them flow. Tips on characters balancing on things, like standing on top of a pole or another person's shoulder. I have a harpy son, and I love him, but I can't pose him. Well, like, for example, if we're going to use the pole thing, I would always, if you're going to make it balance on something, draw the object they are balancing on first, before you ever draw the character, because if you draw the object afterwards, you're going to have balancing issues. But, like, for example, all of the weight of the character has to be right here for them to balance on top of it. So, like, for example, if you had a harpy who is sitting here, their feet would probably have to be perched right here. Their center of gravity would probably have to be pretty low, if we're talking realistically at least. Like, for a harpy, they might have to have their arms in a pretty, matching position to keep balanced. And if one of them, like, for example, if one wing was going to be lower than the other, then, obviously you can get away with more if they're crouching, then one might need to be higher and maybe closer in with the other, just to help maintain that balance. And usually, like, you get your tail there, whatever. If they were standing, on the contrary, if they were supposed to be standing on that pole, then you would want to make sure you focus a lot on, like, where their center of gravity is. So, like, for example, if, like, this character was standing here, and they were just trying to balance on one foot, I'll still do the harpy thing, because you said they are harpy. Then you would want to make sure you know where the center of gravity is. And a good strategy, actually, is to make sure, I heard this once, and this is a really good strategy to making sure your character looks balanced and like they're weighted properly and not like they're awkwardly leaning. Draw a straight line, like from the head to the foot. And if that line is not, if you draw a line, like, here's the head, and if you draw that line straight down, and it connects with the foot that they're weighted, like where their center of gravity is and where all of their weight is, then it'll look balanced. But if you have something, for example, where it's like a character is standing like this, and they're not supposed to be moving, they're supposed to be standing still, and the line goes to the ground, like their foot's over here and their other one's over here, and it goes here, their character's off balance. Your character isn't weighted properly. And that would imply, which works fine if they're moving, if they're in motion, but if they are just standing there, that doesn't work. And if they're standing idly and their weight is on, like, both legs, then you'd actually want that line to be about right in the center because they're weighted equally. So yeah, that's usually a good way to think. Like, if you want to make sure a character is balanced, try making sure that their head and their foot kind of align, with where they're standing and how and with the gravity that is in the picture, and that way you'll know their balance, which does have exceptions. Usually if a character is crouching, you can get away with more because it's a little bit easier to balance when you crouch. Usually when they're standing straight, that's where you can get really off balance. Oh, I'm starting to get a dry throat. How do you draw characters interacting at different heights, both physically as well as location? Well, if you're talking about characters interacting where you can see their entire body, for one thing, make sure you know how tall the characters are in comparison to each other. If you don't have something, like, for example, if you know, like, their heights by, like, numbers, like, like, one's 5'11", one's, like, 3 foot tall, like, there's things online that'll show you the comparison between these two heights. Find that so you can do it. Or, at the very least, figure out how tall they are compared to each other. If you're going to do a full body, make sure you know how tall the characters are compared to one another. So that whenever you draw it, you know how high they come up to the other character, whatever. And then when it comes to interaction, it depends on how you're making them interact. But, like, if you're doing full body pictures of them, you just got to make sure that, like, like, for example, if, like, this one was, like, I don't know, honestly, like, it depends on, again, it's like with the character interacting thing in general, you just want to make sure you're, like, loose about things first, and, like, just get the idea of the poses in, and you can usually, like, fill in and, like, fix things accordingly. But, I don't know, this is a weird pose, but, like, and usually, like, if you have a tall character and a short character interacting, if they're, like, trying to hug or something like that, you might need the shorter character standing on their toes, and you might need the taller character crouching down a little bit, so that would depend on what you're going for, but, like, my best strategy, I would say, is just have a reference or something so you know how tall they are compared to one another. And you can get away with more if it's a half body, because if it's, like, a half body and you can't see their legs, you can always, like, you can adjust their heights in a way and make it where it's like, oh, I don't know, maybe the shorter character's standing on something, maybe the taller one's kneeled down, you have a little bit more anonymity. But when it comes to full body poses, just make sure you know how tall they are compared to one another, and just make sure you build your pose accordingly. And you might need to make some level changes depending on what kind of pose you want them to be in. Like, again, if they're hugging and one's huge compared to the other, you might need them to be crouched down, or you might need the larger character picking up and hugging the other one. So, yeah. What brush do you use for sketching? This is just, like, literally, it is a technical pencil that I have made very, very slight adjustments to. So, yeah. Goofy poses with characters' weapons, like characters pretending to be stabbed. Let me think. The best example I could give of that, I guess, would be, like, if a character was, like, pretending to be stabbed, I would almost do it where it's, like, I mean, again, this is very, very specific, but, like, for example, if a character was pretending to be stabbed by a sword and was trying to be goofy and overdramatic, you would just have to make sure you know where the object is. Make sure you always draw the object before you draw any hands wrapping around it. you know, and then just figure out, like, maybe their arm's under here because it's, like, tucked under their arm. Their torso's right here. And then, like, maybe the hilt is right here. You know, and then their arm is right here. I would definitely look at some references for that, you know. But that would just be a matter of, again, like, just being loose with your sketching and getting the idea of what you want and then going back and refining it. Just because, like, you know, and you might have to, that would also have to do with expressions and stuff, too. You'd have to make sure their pose doesn't look actually in pain, like they weren't actually stabbed, you know? Dog pose tips. Well, I'm not really the best with, I'm not an expert on animals. I'd like to think I can do pretty decent animals, especially when I have a reference. For one thing, references, but like if you want the basic anatomy of a dog or the basic thing, because I mean sometimes the best way to pose characters is just having like a stick figure outline for them. For dogs, I would say it'd be like, this would be like the really basic like stick figure for a dog. Like this is the spine, this is your torso right here, this is your pelvis. Your front legs are going to come out like this. Like, hang on. Like, this is your shoulder, this is your foreleg, this is technically like their ankle area, and that's their paw. You know, and like bent up, it would look something like this. Or not like this, it would look something like, hang on. I'm getting there. Look something like this. That's their neck. This one has a pretty... I tend to draw animals with, like, more long legs than they have in real life. For their back legs, it's kind of like this. Again, I'm not, like, the best when it comes to animals, so there's better, like, tutorials out there, I'm sure. This is kind of the basic idea. Like, this is the basic form you can use when you're trying to pose, like, a dog or something like that. You know, like, sometimes the best way to figure out how to pose things is just figuring out, just a basic, like, skeleton for them, and then, like, making adjustments from there. Because once you have an idea of the skeleton, like, you can really put that skeleton... It's a lot easier to pose a stick figure or a skeleton than it is to pose an actual person, so use that to your advantage. A giant snake that is never ending, or just snake poses? I have a giant snake eye. Well, I mean, snakes are pretty easy. You just gotta figure out, like, where you want the head to be, and then just, like, their entire body is a spine. And snakes are so flexible, you can really, like, if they're never ending, you can do whatever you want with them, like, you know. And then, like, once you have that, you just kind of block everything in, and you figure out, like, how the rest of the body flows with that. So, you know, snakes are pretty easy. They're literally just head and then spine. Superhero poses for fighting. I've been trying to do a comic about my superhero character for a while, but I can't find poses for the life of me. Well, I mean, really look them up. There's plenty of good superheroes out there. In fact, there is actually a by Marvel that talks about, like, poses like that and things of that nature. So I would look that up. I would look at, I'd really look at any TV show or movie or anything. Like, if you have, even if you have, like, a TV or something, and you can find, like, a movie or a TV show, watch it and, like, pause it and, like, look at those poses. I talked a little bit about action poses earlier, so I don't want to go all the way into that again, but, oh, shit. Oh, I thought my stream ended there for a second. I panicked. Okay. So yeah, references, like, there, you can find references out there for that kind of thing. How would you pose someone falling, but their legs are behind them, their legs are in a way? Well, it depends on what, like, if you mean they're falling backwards, then unless their legs are restrained, they wouldn't be... Is my live stream... So, is this... My iPad might just be fucking up. Yeah, my live stream's... yeah, I guess my iPad's... fucking up a little bit. Yeah, so, yeah, if they're falling, okay, because if they're falling backwards, like their head is facing this way, and their body is like this, then unless their legs are restrained, their legs wouldn't be backwards, you know, or they could be, but you would probably have to make sure their, like, arms are back here too, otherwise it will look really awkward, you know, but, like, the easiest way to have their legs bent back is if they're, like, falling forward. Their arms might need to be back here a little bit, though, like, you know, if their legs are bent back here, you know, because I don't know all the context to, like, why this person's falling. They might be twisting a little bit, like, if their body is twisted a little bit, you know, so I guess it would just depend which direction they're falling. Any ideas for a floating and action-ish ponytail from a 3/4 view? Well, I mean, ponytails are pretty, like, if you have a head, depending on how large your ponytail is, if it's just floating, then you just gotta think about the most of the hair as a mass. Again, I don't know how long their hair is, but, like, you know, you just gotta think about it kind of in a mass and fill it in from there. Hair's pretty easy when it comes to this, honestly. Their feet looking too small. Well, I mean, again, references. There are references everywhere for feet. You know, and the thing is, though, you can't really get it, like, escape that, because your feet is always gonna look longer from the side than from the front, because a foot from the front is going to look like, you know, there are your, because here's, like, on the front view, here's your heel, here's your toes, here's the in-between. From the front, there's your toes, there's the in-between, whatever. That's a perspective thing. So feet are always going to look smaller from the front unless you have really wide feet. So, again, I would look for references for that, if needed. Or even just look at some poses. So, because if your feet are facing forward, they're always going to look smaller, unless they're angled, like, super downward, in which case they would look like kind of something like this, you know? Okay, I'm skipping to the bottom, so I'm sorry if I miss any of your questions. How do you do a really hot / hard kissing pose? Like a really passionate kissing pose. You would have to look up references for this. You know, you'd have to, like, look up references. You'd have to make sure you know, like, where their mouths are, because, like, where their mouths connect is going to be key. Connect. So I would look up references for that kind of thing, and then their bodies would be doing whatever their bodies be doing, you know? So make sure you look up references and things like that. Because that would just be something with, like, honestly, when you want to show passion with anything intimate, it's a lot of it can be about body language, to be honest. You can't really, just two people kissing isn't really going to show much unless the expression shows a lot. Do you have any foreshortening tips? Whenever I try, what I explained this earlier too. For example, if you have, like, okay, if you want to figure out how joints are with foreshortening, because I think that's, like, sometimes the hardest thing. For one thing, you got to figure out how big, because, I mean, it does depend how much you're perspecting it. So, like, for example, if we had this hand, and you were trying to figure out how you wanted to do this hand, and you're trying to figure out where to put the elbow, I said it before, is you basically figure out, you kind of connect both these, and you figure out where your midpoint is, and there you go, that's where your elbow is. That's roughly where your elbow is. Obviously, it's a little bit different for different people, you know, so you would do it like that, and you got to make sure it is going to look a little bit weird. It is always, in the process of drawing, it is going to look weird when your wrist is bigger than your elbow from a perspective view, but that's a part of how it is. For, like, fingers, you know, you connect it here, like there's your fingertip. And then for fingers, because fingers are divided into three, you would actually just need to figure out like your 3/4 and your whatever. You know, you can do this for you can do this for like any joints when it comes to perspectives, and it usually is pretty helpful. Just to think about joints, like again, if it's a halfway joint, then you just need to find the midpoint of that of those perspective lines, and then fourths and 1/4. And then this thumb is doing fuck all over here, you know? Because honestly, who needs thumbs? But yes, that would be my tips for like foreshortening. And it is always going to look a little bit weird when certain things are bigger than the things, but that is part of forced perspective. How do you draw someone in a comfy pose without looking weird? I mean, if we're talking about like, I don't know, you're in a big giant beanbag and you're like, oh yes, giant beanbag is the life. Um, I mean, really, that would have to do a lot with expression, whatever. You know, like, I don't know, like, this is just what I'm coming up with the top of my head. You know, that might have to do kind of with expression, but if you're just like, if you want to show someone like all snuggled up looking comfy, usually if like you have someone kind of curled up, you know, sometimes just being curled up can make someone look comfy. Now, granted, it could also make them look scared, but part of that just has to do with tension. Like I said with relaxed poses earlier, it's about like when you want to do something relaxed and like calm, about them curves, you know? Having curves comes off relaxed when having like sharp edges before you even like do anything else comes off like intense and you know, like sharp and alert and energized. So really, before you even like flesh anything out, just doing a stick figure, sharp can mean intense, and then flowy and curvy means relaxed. Do you ever draw a line of action? Yeah. That's what you're really always supposed to do whenever you do poses. It's very helpful, especially for action poses. Idle poses, a little less so, because, you know, like when you're just drawing a character standing still, you know, the line of action is going to be a straight line. It's not going to be very helpful. But yeah, line of action's pretty important, I'd say, when you're doing poses. I'm probably gonna have to I'll probably end it soon, but this has definitely been very successful. So definitely gonna be doing more of these tutorial streams in the future because this was worked out pretty. So yeah, any final questions? I'll probably do like maybe 3 more, and then I'll go ahead and end it. Character interacting with a snake or wearing a snake like a boa. Well, that would be, if they're interacting with a snake, draw the person first and then fill in the snake, because these snakes are really, really easy to pose and draw. So I would just draw, like, the person first. Like,